from you.
Yes, thank you very, very much for having me, and it's really a shame there isn't a direct flight here because I really wish I could just come here every Shabbat. That's so beautiful, and it's so wonderful to see Cantor Alexander in her element after so many years. So first of all, I want to say Shabbat Shalom, and I want to say a huge thank you to Rabbi Sharf, Rabbi Berezin, to my classmate, Cantor Joanna Alexander, for welcoming me to Temple Israel this Shabbat. I'm also so grateful to your incredible staff and dedicated volunteers who made this weekend possible and who have been making it run very smoothly. And I also want to thank all of you for coming to tonight and then hopefully to a couple of things throughout the weekend. I'm looking forward to spending time with you. I'll be learning with a bunch of different groups on several different topics this weekend. So tomorrow morning, we're going to learn about the meet cute between Jacob and Rachel in this week's Torah portion. Tomorrow night, we'll engage with creative approaches to Hanukkah with my dear friend, Dr. Hilary Rubison, who's an expressive arts therapist. And then on Sunday, I'll be sharing my children's books, as I said, which is what I am most known for, with the religious school and introducing the students to the process of creating our own interpretations of our sacred stories. All of these conversations, and really much of the work that I'm passionate about, are connected by a single thread. They are all about the stories we tell, how we tell them, and why they matter. Whether we're looking at a biblical story, a rabbinic legend, a movie, or a modern picture book, we're called to consider, what are the stories we tell, and how do we tell them? Why do we tell some stories over and over and over again? What makes a story sticky enough to stick with us for generations? And whose stories still aren't getting told? So I'm going to start with a story that's probably maybe familiar to some of you. And this comes all the way from the 1st century. We have Hillel and Shammai are frenemies. They're dueling rabbis of their era. And most of the time they disagree. Most of the time we follow Rabbi Hillel. And the interesting thing is we usually follow him because he's more lenient, which you would not expect from the 1st century. So Shammai tends to be a little bit more rigid in his thinking, and Hillel tends to be more flexible. So in this story, a beginner student, perhaps somebody who is looking to join the Jewish people, comes to Shammai first and says, I want to join the Jewish people, but I want you first to teach me the whole Torah while standing on one foot. And I just want to say it's not clear who's standing on one foot in this scenario. It might be the rabbi, it might be the student, and in one cartoon version of this, it is the rabbi standing on the student's foot by accident. Now, Shammai does not like this question, and he is not shy about that. So Shammai says, you're being ridiculous, and chases him away, and some versions even say he smacked him with a ruler. So that's a very old tradition for anybody who unfortunately experienced that in their lifetime. Then this student goes over to Rabbi Hillel and says the exact same question. Teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot, or while one of us stands on one foot. And Hillel says, without much hesitation, what is hateful to you, do not do to any person. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. And most of the time when we're telling the story, we end it there. But the end of the story is actually that this person then becomes a student of Rabbi Hillel and does actually want to learn all the rest that is commentary. But it starts with that one little sentence, the on one foot bit. So now that this story has landed in our laps, or at our feet, as it were, all the way from the 1st century, why do you think we still tell it? Why do you think it stuck with us for so long? Why does it matter? Does anybody want to venture a guess or a theory, because there's no wrong answer, as to why we still tell this story thousands of years later? What's sticky about it? It's simple, yeah. Oh, Joanna, and then behind you. Yes, that you have a real contrast in your rabbinic, your educational approach. And, there's a time and a place for being a stickler, but maybe not with the ruler. Yeah. Joanna. Sorry, Cantor Alexander. Yes, we sort of have a good cop, bad cop thing happening here. But yes, the contrast, because if we had just told the story with, and I always love asking this question because that was actually something I hadn't necessarily thought of. If we told this story just with the Hillel part, it's still a good story. But having the contrast with the Shammai is what makes it, I think, a great story. Because you see some guy is saying, I can't teach you the whole Torah while we stand on one foot. That's ridiculous. And the other guy says, watch me. I can do that. So there are many reasons that this story might stick with us. It might be because of the odd visual of an ancient rabbi standing precariously on one foot. It might be the simplicity of the message. It might be the not-so-subtle dig at Shammai for being a stickler. But for whatever the reason, this story has stuck with us for centuries, and in an era when we are often overrun by information. This message to keep things simple still resonates, as does the message to be kind to others. I recently tried to tell this story. My niece is almost 5, and when she's sitting at the dinner table, she always wants to be told a story. And I tried to tell her this one, but realized she doesn't know Hillel, she doesn't know Shammai, she doesn't really even know what rabbi or Torah is at this point. So I said that somebody came to Hillel and said, teach me everything I need to know while I stand on one foot. And Hillel said, be kind. Much of what we're exploring together this weekend falls under the category of midrash, which comes from the Hebrew word meaning to explore or examine. Midrash refers to a process of interpreting biblical stories, as well as the genre of literature resulting from that process. While many midrash align with what we think of as a sermon or a Dvar Torah, which is a textual analysis that leads to some sort of message, many of them take on a more creative component. Midrash are stories about stories in the Bible, or, as Rabbi Sharf said yesterday, biblical fan fiction. Midrash is a way to breathe new life into existing stories and characters, or what the TV and film industries call existing IP, intellectual property. You can see the midrashic process in many different fictional canons. Modern adaptations of Shakespeare and Jane Austen, Marvel Universe spin-offs, and Star Wars prequels, to name a few. This is all, in a way, midrash, designed to answer questions we have about the original story, and also to allow us to spend more time in the universes of these stories that delight us and challenge us. Engaging with the midrashic process reminds us that these stories belong to us, and that they don't have to stay frozen in the time and place where they were written or where they were received. My midrash career began primarily in response to a frustrated bat mitzvah student who asked me, why do we even bother to mention Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah in our prayers when they didn't even do anything? I searched, having written my thesis on some of the women in the Bible, I searched for age-appropriate books about the biblical women that I admired to share with a student, though in retrospect she probably could have just read my thesis. And when I didn't find what I was looking for, I realized that I'd have to start writing them myself, and so that's what I did. And a side note, that conversation happened in 2009, and that bat mitzvah student just graduated from Creighton University Medical School. That's how long it took some of this material to make its way into the world. When we think about the stories we tell, it's important to consider whose stories get told, and more importantly, whose stories still aren't getting told, and what can we do to change that? In the children's book industry, there is the talk of the need for mirrors and windows. Mirrors, so that children can see characters who are like themselves in the story, and develop a sense of identity and a sense of pride. And windows so that they can see characters who are not like they are and develop their sense of empathy and compassion. And this is why we need to see a diversity of characters in all kinds of media, including but not limited to children's literature. So I encourage you to consider, you don't have to share this now, but perhaps we'll share it at Oneg. What is the first time you saw yourself or someone who is like you in a book or a television show or a movie? What did it feel like to see yourself represented? And what are some of the stories about people who are not like you that helped teach you empathy and compassion towards others? In my writing, I wanted to lift up the stories of lesser-known biblical characters, particularly women who are not the matriarchs, so that they could be seen more clearly than they are in the original text, but also so that readers could see themselves in them. When I originally told the story that would become my first picture book, The World Needs Beautiful Things, one of our religious school teachers approached me afterwards and said, "Hey, I think that story was about me." And in fact, the story was about Bezalel, the artisan who designs the tent of meeting for the Israelites when they're wandering in the wilderness. But in my version, he is also a child who is always getting distracted by shiny things he finds in the desert. This teacher went on to explain that for her, the story was clearly about someone who had ADHD. And while this hadn't been my conscious intention, since the book came out, many readers who identify as neurodivergent have resonated with this depiction of Bezalel. Seeing ourselves in the story matters. When I wrote Queen Vashti's comfy pants, I asked the illustrator to show many different skin tones, ages, and body types. I also asked the illustrator to depict one of Vashti's ladies in waiting using a wheelchair. And I've heard from families of children with mobility issues that this small detail meant a lot to them. And especially if you've read the book, on the last page you see all the ladies in waiting having all of these fabulous adventures, and you see one of the women who is using a wheelchair in the jungle playing with monkeys. Similarly, my most recent book, The Moving Box Sukkah, one of my only ones that is set in the modern day, got some attention this year on a Facebook page for Jewish single moms by choice, because that book happens to feature a boy and his mother with no mention of a second parent. This is what we call incidental representation, when a particular identity is represented, but that identity is not central to the plot of the story, or even made out to be a big deal. It just is. And that's another important way of being seen. At best, storytelling can help us to learn empathy and compassion. That's why it's so important for young people to have access to stories that show the real human experiences of people from different backgrounds and different situations. We need those stories, both fiction and nonfiction, in children's literature and adult literature and young adult literature, so that people can see themselves and others in their pages. So for years, I had this dream of bringing some lesser-known biblical characters alive for my most inquisitive students and their families. I envisioned a book that parents and children would steal from each other. And this dream finally came true during the pandemic. My pandemic baby was a book. And I got to write this book with my dear friend and former college roommate, Erica Wovsaniker. Maybe It Happened This Way, Bible Stories Reimagined, is a collection of creative midrash on Torah stories for middle grade readers, and middle grade is from 4th grade to 8th grade, though I know people older and younger who've enjoyed it. As a rabbi and a Hebrew school teacher, respectively, we both wanted our students to be able to read our sacred stories with the same excitement they felt when they were reading Percy Jackson or Harry Potter. We wanted them to be able to see themselves in the sacred story, to take ownership of the stories in the Bible, and to be empowered to write their own stories as well. But taking a creative approach to the sacred story isn't just for kids. We might think of storytelling as the fluffy part of our tradition, but Rabbi Aviva Richmond of the Hadar Institute reminds us that in the Jewish tradition, there is no law without story. Even as our sacred texts give us clear-cut commandments on how to live our lives, we also see, often on the very same page, stories that show us the nuances and the shades of gray. For instance, when the rabbis discuss how to care for the poor, we are told that we must provide for whatever a poor person needs, but that we are not required to make a poor person rich with our donations. What then follows are a series of stories about people who really needed something that others would consider a luxury: meat, aged wine, fancy cutlery, a horse, a servant, and even a wife. The stories show us how the rabbis accommodated these special cases and what the consequences were when they didn't. These stories turned the cut and dry legal definitions of essentials and luxuries on their heads. They serve to remind us that each person's needs are different and that we need to take their individual stories into account before making snap decisions or painting with a broad brush. I often pair these ancient stories with a modern account from a journalist detailing the judgments people felt entitled to make about what she put in her shopping cart when she was shopping with food stamps. These stories are still relevant. Part of our sacred task in modern times is to figure out how we adapt our own ideas and practices in response to the real human stories we encounter every day in our rapidly changing world. Stories can teach us that sometimes we have to be flexible in our thinking. So I wanted in closing to share another one of my favorite stories, and this story, as many Jewish stories do, involve a chassid and a litvak. So let me just explain what that is. When we think of a chassid, we think of an ultra-Orthodox Jew usually, and that is what a chassid is. But in the 18th century, when this movement emerged, they were actually kind of a radical movement. They were kind of the hippies of their day. So they were very spiritual, and they liked to sing, and they liked to dance, and they liked to hug trees, and they didn't want to sit and study all day. So that's sort of what the chassid is, or the prototype of the chassid. The litvak, which means from Lithuania, the litvak is a person who is the opposite of that. The litvak is the person who's very traditional, who likes to sit in the study hall and study, who's a rule follower, and who doesn't like to have any fun. So, and I always joke, even though this is not my actual, ancestral origins, that I am what happens when chassids marry litvaks. So the chassid and the litvak are walking down the street, and they happen upon a person who is greasing the wheels of their wagon on the side of the road. And the person happens to be wearing their talit, their prayer shawl, and their tefillin, which are these leather boxes that people wear on their forehead or their bicep when they are praying. And these are things that are typically worn in the synagogue, in the home, specifically when they're praying. They're not something that you usually wear when you're doing roadside maintenance. And of course, the litvak is horrified. And the litvak says, this is a shanda, this is a disgrace, those things are holy items and they're gonna get dirty, and he's showing no respect for these items. So either he's ignorant and he doesn't know that you're not supposed to take these things out of the synagogue or out of the home or out of the prayer context, or he does know that and he's either being defiant or he just doesn't care. And either way, it's a disgrace. And the chassid, looking at the very same scene, says something a little different. He looks up at the sky and he goes, God Almighty, look at how much your children love you. Even when they are greasing the wheels of their wagon, they are praising you. So this is one of my favorite stories, and I wanted to give us, before I wrap up, just one moment. Why do you think that story matters? What do you think it's meant to teach us? Does anyone have any theories? Yes. Perspective, yes. Any other theories? I always think that, oh yes, one more. Right, that God might care about our spiritual intention rather than the letter of the law. Yes. So So I find this a very important story as a Jewish professional, to be able to look at the different ways that people show up in the Jewish community and to make space for all of them. And another reason this story matters to me is that it reminds me to be curious, not judgmental, to assume positive intent, and not to jump to conclusions. I also love this story because it's about the storytelling that we do every day. The chassid and the litvak both saw the same person greasing the wheels of their wagon in their talit and their tefillin, but each of them told a completely different story about why it was happening. And it's important to hear both stories. But you know who we never hear from. We never hear from the person who is actually greasing the wheels of their wagon in their talit and tefillin. I wonder what they might have to say about it. I wonder what story they might have to tell. So I'm going to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to continue our conversations at Oneg, at Torah study, and at tomorrow night's program as well. Thank you so much for having me.